Okay. So what I'm going to cover today then, why do employers want to question you about change and adaptability? What is it that they're looking for? And I want to start you thinking on how adaptable you are and maybe how you start to think in a more change ready way. I'll talk a bit about reactions to change, a little bit of theory on change. It's not that you need to know all of the theory going into an interview, but it's useful to have some knowledge of it if it's not something that you're already aware of. And as I said, this isn't a session on how to introduce change or how to manage change, but I do think that it is useful to know how people can react to change because it will give you a better understanding of what managers are looking for in your answers, and also a bit about introducing change, again, so that you can pull some information for interviews. I'll talk a little bit about how to frame your story because you may be someone who doesn't really like change, but you will have dealt with change. All of us have. So it's important to be able to frame things positively. Even if you're someone that says, I really don't like change, it's about framing that positively. And as usual, we'll finish off with some sample interview questions. Okay, so first of all, I'd like you to think about the changes that you have been faced with in the last year or two. Now, certainly there have been a lot of changes because of COVID, but as well as that, many of you will have made changes by, maybe transitioning to university life. Perhaps it's the first time that you've been living away from home and looking after yourself. Perhaps you've got a new part-time job and you're adjusting to working life as well. Maybe you've chosen to make some changes in your own personal life, like maybe becoming a vegan or trying out a new sport, lots of different things. And maybe some changes have been put on you that have not been your choice. Maybe you've had to, for example, give up accommodation that you liked or put up with a new flatmate that you're not particularly fond of. And of course, there are all the changes that we adapted to with working from home and learning new technology, etc. And I think we've all had to do some adapting because of that. If you can think of anything, you're welcome to pop it into the chat and maybe we'll have some comments on that. So anybody who's feels that they've got some good examples of change, happy to pop that into the chat for us, go ahead. So we're all continually managing change in our lives all of the time. And often we don't acknowledge that we are doing that. We're doing that because we just tend to get on with it. We don't say to ourselves, I'm managing this change. You just do it and you don't really reflect on that. So we don't always recognize the changes that we have adapted to, but it is worthwhile thinking about how we adapt to those changes and what has helped us to do that. Is it something about your personality, your own strengths that have helped you to do that? Or is it just your knowledge that has got you through? And it's also worth recognizing when we find change particularly hard. Maybe not something that you particularly want to discuss at interview because you're trying to keep things positive, but you may well be asked about a change that you find, to be quite difficult as well. Even if you don't discuss something like that at interview, I think it's really worth reflecting on. So pop into the chat some examples of how you've managed changes. Perhaps it might be around exercise or socializing, eating out, learning, studying, anything at all. It could be about helping others, and it could even be about helping someone else adjust to something, adjust to change. So it might be that you've been working in a team or in a club or society or something, and how you've, maybe done some adjustment there. And you notice I've gone quiet now because I'm waiting to see if anybody wants to pop anything into the chat there. Okay, we'll move on if you can still pop stuff in if you can think of anything. Okay, so we all know that change is necessary and that there are many factors influencing change. Environmental changes, we all know about those, such as the focus on sustainability, funding, more maybe more funding or less funding will make a difference to what departments or companies can do. Social changes, do people still want what you're providing, what your company is providing? For example, it's not so long ago that almost every Christmas card and every piece of Christmas wrapping paper had glitter on it. And now, because of sustainability, most of them, the vast majority of them, are without glitter and made in a much more sustainable way. So social pressure can bring about change in how companies do things. Political changes, from changes in government policy, Brexit, etc. Demographic changes, which can be anything from not getting the same footfall in a shopping centre because it has fallen out of fashion, perhaps, to global changes. And of course, the huge amount of technological changes that seem to be coming at us at a faster and faster rate. So many things requiring us to make changes all the time. Did I see something come into the chat there, Karen?
You did, Roisin. So Alex has put in the chat his adjustment to course rep is worth noting, and also the take-home exams, which have been introduced obviously because of COVID. He says he'd never attempted that at uni level. So, so I think there's some really good examples of coping with change. Yeah.
And something like that, just the exams. It's something, it's not just the technological changes you have to deal with, but your own sort of mental processes and being able to deal with it as well. So yeah, and it is worth acknowledging that that is a change that you deal with. So if it gets any of the rest of you thinking about anything else, that's worth it as well. So thanks very much for that, Alex. Okay, moving on then. So we know that change has to happen. Companies have to react to changes around them and also be proactive in forming change. They really don't have the option of standing still. So knowing that changes happen all the time, what do you think is generally the biggest obstacle to a company being able to implement change successfully? So a company wants to implement change, and obviously they want it to be successful. What's usually the biggest obstacle to them? Pop it into the chat.
So I think there's some typing going on.
Yeah.
Alex has come back. Again, he said negative or an undesirable reaction.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. So it could be things like not having the right technology, or reading the market wrong, or implementing the change at the wrong time, because that can be significant. But generally it is because of, and I think, Alex, you probably nailed it with that, mindsets and attitudes. So whenever you're saying about that negative attitude, that's exactly the sort of thing that's going to prevent change, prevent change from being, successful. So if you think about it in terms of what an employer will want from an employee around change, that mindset and attitude is what you want to be able to demonstrate at your interviews. So that was just a study, according to an IBM study. So according to Peter Singh, people don't resist change, they resist being changed. And that's worth thinking about, because it isn't that, people are totally against change happening. It's that they don't want others to force that change on them. And in your personal life, people usually make their own choices. They put in place the changes that they choose to put in place. Not always, of course, because we all have to do things we don't necessarily want to do. But, we tend to have a bit more choice in our own personal lives than we do at work. At work, we can feel maybe coerced into changing things. And so often people don't feel that they have the power, over what's happening. And in order to feel that they're regaining a bit of control, you get resistance to change, because it's usually the one thing that people can do is resist the change. So Seng says that to avoid the resistance, you should give people some control and let them make decisions. It's not always possible, but it usually will end up better if you can give people a say in what way at least the change is going to happen. So if you're going to implement a change, then some things that might help you to bring people along on that change would be to communicate enough about the change to them. Remember, it's about mindsets and attitudes. So people need to know what the change is, why we're doing it in the first place, the reason for it. Because you'll have people saying, we were all right the way we were, we don't need this. How it relates to their particular job role. Because, if you talk about something at a company-wide level, an individual wants to see how it actually relates to them and the work that they're doing. What benefits the organisation and particularly the person might get from the change. So again, bringing it not just at the organisational level, but bringing it down to the individual level as well. And what the priorities are, especially if there are lots of changes that are going to be made at the same time. What are the main issues and what they actually need to do in order to successfully navigate the change? So, what are the behaviours that need to change as well? Again, there might be some things there that you could incorporate into your interview answers, just some of that, process and that jargon. But mostly the important thing is to think about it in terms of what change you've dealt with in the past. Have you been in a company, for example, any of you who have been working where you've seen change introduced? Could you look at it in terms of what went well, what didn't go well? Okay, so it's just to get you thinking about the process of change. So we pretty much covered why you need to be able to talk about change and adaptability. Now I want to move on to how adaptable you are, how adaptable you as an individual are to change, or your reaction to change. Now, there's all sorts of questionnaires on this, which you could certainly get online, but I think that people tend to have a gut reaction to change. So people generally know if they are the sort of person who likes change or not. So what I'm going to do is just give you some phrases, you'll see them up there, and you just check out where you sit on the change preferences. So do the first set of statements mostly fit with you? And those are: change means excitement to me. I get a thrill from change. I welcome challenges to try out new things. I try to welcome critical feedback. I would find no change boring. I look for opportunities to develop my new skills and knowledge. Change means progress to me. So you can see from those statements that it's all very positive around change. Or does this set of statements suit you better? I find uncertainty frightening. I like what I know. Change means a threat to me. I find it frustrating to be a beginner. I mind changes which alter my close relationships. I am suspicious of people who suggest change. New colleagues sap my energy. So now, if the first set of statements appeal to you, then you're probably more ready for change, more change ready, than if the second set of statements relate more to you. So, it's not a test or anything like that. It's just to give you some idea of, what you normally feel about change. So if there was a change spectrum, you would probably see yourself as someone who is ready for what you might see as a change or an opportunity or perhaps a challenge. And if you're at the other side of the spectrum, the change spectrum, you're probably looking at the change as something to be concerned about. It might take a little bit more time to get used to it for you. And remember, when you were looking at those statements, were you thinking about change as something that you were instigating or something that was imposed on you? Because that makes a huge difference to how you view the change. Maybe you're someone who likes to change things up regularly as long as you are doing the choosing. as to what those changes might actually be. So just thinking about it in terms of, do you see change as a chance or a challenge, or is it something to be concerned about or avoided more? And if you're someone whose natural reaction to change is to be concerned, then you might have some very natural and valid concerns. And we've seen a huge amount of changes lately with companies, changing their structure, downsizing, introducing new technology, wanting new skills. So worries such as, can I learn something new? Will my job change to something I don't enjoy anymore? Will my status and security be lost? Will I be moved to another department or another branch of the company? Will I lose my job? And the very overarching, why do we have to change the way we do things? And all of these are valid concerns. They're not necessarily the concerns that managers will want you to have. It's not that go-getting mindset, but they are valid concerns. And whether you're the person that's bringing change into the company or you're an employee who's having to deal with the change, you need to be aware that that is the sort of thing that many, many people will feel. And I think that it can be all too easy for management and indeed some other colleagues to overlook these very natural fears. But it is exactly the sort of thing that can mean success or failure of implementing a change in an organisation. So they shouldn't be overlooked, and proper communication would be needed to alleviate some of the concerns. So making sure that people's concerns are taken on board and that you're communicating well enough so that some of those concerns are alleviated. So if we were looking again at the previous slide, I think that it's important to look at the sort of characteristics that might be associated with people who are not keen on change. So just looking at those wee phrases there, I'm happy with predictability and order, and knowing with confidence what needs to be done by when and how. And if I were to ask you what are the characteristics of people who are not change oriented, some of you might say something like, well, they're likely to be older people. And that could well be true. But if you think of it, if you think about it, the older you are, the more change you've been through. So I think it is more about character. And you might say that they are set in their ways or loyal to the old ways or very process driven. But are any of those such bad things? Because when the change goes through, what you will want are people who know how to do the job and continue to do it well and are reliable and steady and loyal and follow the processes. So remember that when you're talking about change at interview, you may consider yourself as someone who isn't very change oriented, but you will have been through many changes just the same as everyone else. And it is about how you talk about it that is important. So always be thinking about how you manage the change and how you can talk about it positively. That doesn't mean that you can't acknowledge the difficulties involved, but how you overcame them is really important. So consider that, if you'd have a difficult change to manage. Anything in the chat that I need to address, Karen?
No, we're good, Roisin.
Okay. So moving on then to reactions to change and just a very little bit of theory. You won't often see me putting diagrams like this up in a PowerPoint, but you know that this session is purely to help you to talk about change at interview. But I thought that it was important to cover one or two of the basic, theories just around this sort of topic, just in case you might have a reason for incorporating it or simply need the knowledge of it. And so I wanted to have a quick look at the Kubler-Ross change curve. And this basically describes, for any of you who haven't come across it before, the internal emotional journey that people typically experience when they're dealing with change and transition. And I think it really comes from when someone suffers a loss, which exactly is what a change is, so any sort of change that happens, even if it's a positive change, there is some sort of loss involved in that change. So the journey consists of a number of stages that people go through: shock and denial, anger or frustration, depression, exploring or experimenting, um, decision or acceptance, and integration or problem solving. And I'll just describe each stage a little bit. So the shock and denial part, so after the initial shock of being confronted with a change, people often resist engaging with the change, as if they're trying to prove that the change is unnecessary or it isn't really happening. So there's that the denial phase then can have an additional burst of energy where people are looking for evidence that it isn't actually true. And I know that that can sound a bit dramatic, but if you think about it, just even in terms of something like you hear that a shop is going to be closing, or maybe you're an employee in a shop that there's rumors that it's going to be closing, and people are asking others, what have you heard about it? Do you think it could be true? I don't think it will ever happen. So there's denial about it as well. Anger and frustration, then people begin to realize that actually something is going on. They can no longer avoid engaging with it. At this point, the denial often gives way to anger or frustration, and the idea that it's not fair may often take hold, and often others are blamed. And generally, in the case of a company, it's usually management that'll be blamed. Depression, then. So, obviously, in a company, performance tends to decline at this stage. People are feeling lacking in energy. Blame may turn towards themselves, even. And people will often need help to look realistically at the impact the changes will have on them individually. Because, some people do catastrophize about things. Maybe they've heard rumors about how bad things are going to go. And so it is up to the people that are actually instigating the changes to make sure that the correct information is out there for people. So this is a stage where people are really feeling the loss and the cost to them individually. And managers would do very well not to ignore or try to minimize that. So up to this point, the process has been very much about trying to hold on to the current situation. The realization that all efforts are failing leaves people at their lowest point in terms of their performance, in terms of their energy, and in terms of morale. So confusion, sadness, and even depression are all characteristic of this period. So coming through this period requires a point of acceptance, and the person begins to accept at a deeper level that the change is indeed happening and has some resolve to face what will be a new future. So up until now, it's been very much a downwards curve where people are, in denial, in frustration, and finally in depression before they accept that the change is actually happening. And then there's a bit of a turnaround there. So at the experiment and explore stage, the acceptance has to come for people to begin to start to be outward looking and to start to explore new possibilities. And then they make a decision basically. So they begin to engage with the new situation. They then start to look at how they can work in this new situation. And they begin to engage even in problem solving behaviors to actually make the change a success. And finally, integration. And they try out new approaches and eventually they integrate these into the new way of working. And of course, as they begin to problem solve and settle into the situation, their morale, their confidence, and their performance also improves as well. So that's the Kubler-Ross change curve, a maybe very simpler version just in terms of the way that people speak about it. Less theoretical way of looking at the curve is a sort of comments that people would be making as they go through the process. So shock and denial, this change is news to me. Frustration and anger, this is a worse way of working. Depression, this is stressing me out, having to learn to work differently. Accept and experiment, maybe this could actually solve some of the problems we've been having. And then the stage that you really want people to get to, which is where people think that this is a great way of working. So that's the Kubler-Ross. So just to give you some very brief information on two other change theories, and these are a bit shorter in detail. So what we've just looked at is how people process and deal with change. And then these two theories are about implementing a change in organizations. So I will put more detailed slides into the PDF that I'm giving you, but I'm going to miss out a couple of them here because I don't need to go through all of the detail here with you. The first one you should know then is Kurt Lewin's change model. And it focuses on 3 stages, which you can see depicted there: unfreezing, changing, and refreezing. And the process starts with unfreezing, which is altering the present state. So what is happening currently has to alter before change can happen. Okay, so whatever is happening at current times, it has to alter before you can actually integrate the change. So in the unfreeze stage, you need to find out exactly what needs to change. Put in place the people who are going to support that, the leaders and the support people, and create the need for the change. So create a vision around the change. Let people know why the change has to happen. And also manage and understand the doubts and the concerns, which is, what we've just talked about, the doubts and concerns that people would have. What are the driving and what are the resisting forces to the change? And then the next phase is when the actual change is introduced. And this phase needs a lot of communication because this is where you're taking people through the change. And there's often a lot of confusion, a lot of having to dispel rumors, giving people the power to take action. So if you remember what Peter's saying, the quote that I give you at the very beginning about people don't want change imposed on them. So giving people the power to take action, to implement the change, and involving people in the whole process. And then the last phase is the refreeze stage. And this is where all the change effort is stabilized and refrozen into its new form. So anchoring the changes into the culture, developing ways to sustain the change, providing support and training, and celebrating successes. And as I said, I will put, that level of detail into the copies of the slides for you. So there's another couple of slides in there that I'm not going to talk through. So the very last theory that I'm going to give you is Kotter's change model. And John Kotter suggests that for change to be successful, 75% of the people need to buy into the change. In other words, you have to really work hard on step 1 and spend a lot of time and energy building urgency around it before moving on to the next steps. And he says, not to panic and jump in too fast because you don't want to risk further short-term losses. So if you act without proper preparation, you could make things much more difficult for yourself, much more difficult for the company. So Kotter has his 8-step model, and you will see a lot of the same phrases used between the models. So they're here for you to pick up the terminology that might work for your change examples. Okay, and that brings me on to framing your story. So when an employer is asking you questions about change, it's because they basically want people who can not only deal with change when it happens, but also instigate and implement change when it is needed. They want people who proactively keep up with changes affecting their industry. So, certainly read the journals and the industry magazines and do your research on the industry before you go into any sort of interview. Look for ways to make change work instead of identifying why it won't work. And I think that it is important to note that, identifying why something won't work is also important. But then you have to look beyond the negatives to find the solutions. So remember, it's all about that positive mental attitude and how you frame things positively. So they'll want employees who can make suggestions for increasing the effectiveness of changes, that can shift strategies or approaches in response to the demands of the situation. So adapt to the changing demands of a situation, essentially. Um, employees who employees who continuously seek out ways to improve things at project and company level. And that's certainly, if you're doing a part-time job or something like that, you may well have examples of how you've been able to integrate some new changes into the work, or maybe even within your coursework as well. So continuously seeking out ways to improve things at project and company level. So, how can we improve quality, streamline processes, satisfy customers? They'll want employees who can adapt quickly and easily to change, because we have to do that on a constant basis, who will show willingness to learn new methods, new procedures, or techniques, and can adjust to changing environments while maintaining effectiveness. Because when all the change is happening, usually the job still has to be done as well. And make good choices for the good of the company or the organization. And then change your behavioral style or method of approach when necessary to achieve a goal. And for example, that might be about how you work with a team or an individual. You might have examples of that from, your clubs and societies or your coursework. Do you always have to go by the book, or is this the occasion to change that? And they want employees who can respond to change with a positive attitude and a willingness to learn. And I think that that is always something that you can talk about and you should have examples for. So consider these points when you're coming up with your examples and framing your responses, because those are sort of what an employer is looking for in an employee around change and adaptability. So whenever you're thinking of your examples, try to frame it in that sort of way, using those sort of ideas around it. And still on framing your answers, again, I'll just remind you about the STAR technique for effectively answering interview questions. Basically, you want to be able to tell the interviewer your story by putting your answer into context for them. Because remember that an interviewer is likely to be asking, maybe 10 people the same questions that morning or that day. So you want to stand out for them, but at the very least, you want to make your answers clear and legible for them. So when you're formulating an answer for your interview, try following this STAR technique. It makes your answers clear, it makes them logical, and it means that you're getting across the main points that you need to. So start by listening to the question. Think of the example that you're going to use. Hopefully you will have already prepared that answer. But even if you're, thinking on your feet, frame your answer into situation, task, action, and result. Describe the event or situation that you were in. Explain the task that you had to complete. What were the challenges? Describe the specific actions that you personally took to complete the task. And you can say what you did as a team, but you should also say what you personally did, because, you're the individual being interviewed. And finish with the results. What was the results of your actions? Were there benefits? Were there savings? What was the impact? Okay, so that's the STAR technique. And then I just want to make you aware of a software package that's available to you to practice your interviews. It's called ShortlistMe, and Karen will put the link into the chat for you, but you can find it on the careers website as well. And the package basically provides interviews for specific companies, for example, Virgin Media, AstraZeneca, and the NHS. But it also provides a chance to interview for, particular roles, for example, roles in law or in banking or in engineering. So there's a broad range of interviews for you to practice on. Once you register, you're in control of the interview, but you only have 3 days to complete the interview at the time. So you choose a time that suits you whenever you decide that it's a good time for you to do it now, but you only have 3 days from when you register. Now, you're not interacting with any real life people, so that's important for you to know. There's no real life people involved, so there's nothing for you to be wary of. You'll be responding to pre-recorded questions as if it was an online interview. You get some time to prepare your answer, and then you give your answer. And it's about 5 or 6 questions each interview. And the important thing is that you then get some feedback on how you did. Again, this is automated feedback, so you're not interacting with anyone, but it is a good interactive quality experience. So Karen will put that link into the chat. I think she's already done that.
I've
And
just done it. Yeah,
thank
with
you,
the
Karen.
PDF too, Roisin.
Okay, Grant, just to tell you about how it works. And yeah, just go ahead and make the most of it, folks, because it's there for you to practice your interviews. And a lot of the interviews are online now, so it's really good to be able to do that. But it's also a good way to practice for live interviews too, because the questions and how you answer them, are going to be important, whether it's a live one or an in-person one or an online one. So, interview questions then. What is the biggest change that you've had to deal with, and how did you handle it? Folks, because you're preparing your answers, you know, you may well have had a huge change in your life that you don't want to discuss at interview. The point of preparing these ahead of time is that you choose something that you are willing to discuss at interview and that you can talk about really well. So, how did you handle it? Think about that process in terms of the difficulties in change and about how you maybe thought that through and took on board some of that and were able to process that change. Another question then, tell me about a change that you have implemented to improve things at work. And that could be at work, or it could be within your coursework, or it could be within a club or society. It's great if you have part-time work to be able to refer to, but if you don't have that, still look for examples from, other areas of your life. Describe a situation where you started off thinking that your approach was the best, but needed to alter your course during the implementation. So that's basically looking at, changing things midway, looking at what needed to be dealt with and adapting to that. Because remember, it's about change and adaptability. Can you give an example of a time you influenced a colleague or manager to adopt your way of thinking? Okay, so it's about how did you influence someone else into that change? Talk about a situation where you were asked to do something that you had never attempted previously. Tell us how one of your projects suffered a setback due to an unexpected change in circumstances. Tell us about a time when you had to adjust to someone's way of working to achieve a goal or complete a project. So that's, these are all transferable skills. So that's about working with others, managing that change around being able to do something differently to meet a goal. So remember, put your answers into the STAR framework. Position your response in a positive way, even if the change was not entirely successful or if it was uncomfortable for you. It's all about, what you learned from it. But as I say, the more that you can prepare the answers that you actually want to say, I always feel that if you haven't prepared answers and then you're asked something, you tend to blurt out something that you don't necessarily want to talk about. So the more that you have answers prepared, the better. So now might be a good time if anyone has any questions that they would like to ask.
We haven't got anything in the chat as yet, Roisin.
Still thinking about it,
We're
folks?
still thinking about it. I'll keep an eye on it. I'll let you know if anything comes in.
Okay. All right. Well, you think about it, and I shall give you just a couple of wee reminders. So obviously the slides for the PDF will be in the chat as well. Please fill in the feedback form before you go. And as I said, if you want a chance to win the £25 shopping voucher, please put in your contact details as well. And I'm just going to put up the list of other employability skills sessions coming up. They will be in the PDF, so you don't need to make note of it here or anything, but just to give you the chance to see that there are lots more of these sessions coming up as well. I haven't put the times in there, but they're usually 1 hour sessions, usually around lunchtime, but I do change it up a bit to give people a chance depending on what their timetable is. So again, and I will maybe just stop the recording, give people a chance to ask questions.